So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. My name is Mia Marzotto, and I'm the Senior Advocacy Officer at Translators Without Borders, and I'll be moderating this session today on the role of language for data-driven humanitarian action. I'll jump right into presenting our wonderful speaker lineup. So we have quite a few different people with different backgrounds and located in different places around the world. So Chloe Sidney is a researcher at the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, and she focuses on the relationship between internal displacement and cross-border movements, and as well as internal displacement associated with slow onset environmental change. We have David Okutu, who's a trained demographer and has worked in the field of monitoring and evaluation for over 10 years with Mercy Corps in different countries, and right now is in Maiduguri, Northeast Nigeria, where for the past 3 years, he has worked as country monitoring and evaluation manager. And we also have Nayana Das, who's the head of research at Impact Initiatives, where she oversees the implementation of all of the global research projects and the development of innovative ways to improve impacts, research methods, and approaches. And finally, my colleague, Eric DeLuca, who's the monitoring, evaluation, and learning manager at Translators Without Borders. He's a geographer by training and also coordinates TWB's language mapping efforts that you'll also hear more about during the presentation. So a couple of housekeeping points for you all today. This is probably not your first session at the JONJ forum, but we're hoping to have a lively conversation, or at least a discussion on language challenges and examples of approaches and projects that are aimed at ensuring language is taken into account in humanitarian data collection to inform humanitarian programs. And as I said, we're hoping to stimulate an honest conversation. So you'll hear from each of the speakers, and we'll then have time for questions and answers. At the same time, though, we'll be using some Slido poll questions. If you haven't used this feature yet during the conference, you see on the right side of the screen, there's a little interactivity tab. And you should be able to click on that and click on polls, and that's where you can answer poll questions coming up. If you do that now, you'll see that there's already a poll question for you there. So I invite you to take a few moments to answer the question in one word. What comes to mind when you think about language and data collection? So if you can take a few moments to answer the question, we'll then get started with the presentations. Okay, so I see necessary, expensive, costly. Okay, there's a theme there. Any other? Complexity, tricky, another theme perhaps. Any other answers? better communication. That's definitely the goal. Challenging and barriers. Well, these are all great answers. I mean, there's no wrong answer, but some initial food for thought also for our panelists. So I think without further ado, I'll give the floor to my colleague Eric, who will set a bit the stage in terms of what we mean when we talk about language challenges, and some of TWB's thinking around this, and some of the work that we've been doing in implementing or in addressing some of these challenges. So I'll stop sharing my screen, Eric, so that you can share yours.
That's good. Are you able to see this?
Yes, I can.
Okay,
others
perfect.
can.
Great. Well, I'm really glad that some people brought up some of the barriers, like it being supporting language in data collection is costly or difficult or tricky, I think was one of the words used. Because I hope today that we can help demystify a bit of that. I'm not going to sit here saying that it's not expensive or it doesn't take resources or it doesn't take planning, but I think some of the things hopefully that we can propose today and discuss and talk about will help make some things feel more manageable. And some things help people to figure out how to better plan or resource or coordinate some of the needs beyond it. So it doesn't always have to be expensive. It doesn't always have to be challenging to support language properly in data collection. So as Mia said, I'm the Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning Manager at TWB. And Translators Without Borders, for those of you who don't know us, we are a global organization that supports a bunch of other organizations around the world through specialized language support. Our goal is to break down language barriers and to help ensure that people can communicate proper two-way communication in humanitarian and development contexts. And a lot of the support we do is for other organizations who are struggling and trying to figure out how to provide that support directly to the populations they're working for. So not only do we do translation work, but we also do capacity building, we do mapping, we do advocacy and research, we do terminology support, and a whole slew of other kind of technology focused work as well that we'll talk a bit about today. And I think with COVID on the top of everyone's minds and sort of having thrown our industry on its head over this last 9 or 10 months, I think it's a really, I've been thinking a lot about how that's changed, what it means for language and data collection. And so today, I just kind of wanted to share with you what I see as 5 common language challenges in humanitarian data collection. And these are things not exclusive to this year. They're trends that sort of we've been noticing previous to this as well, but I think a lot of them have really become exacerbated in the crisis that we're facing, partly because a lot of us have had to move to remote ways of working. We've had to adapt in-person data collection to maybe have less supervision or more phone interviews or more digital tools that we're using through social media or chatbots. And I think a lot of that has sort of highlighted some of these challenges that we've noticed. So the first one I talk about is a lack of reliable data on languages. And this is really something that's been happening for several years, and that we notice a lot more when we run into a crisis like this, where language becomes such an important factor that we need to plan for. We don't really know where to start. And part of the reason we don't know where to start is because we don't have data available on the languages that people speak or understand. So if you think of a traditional survey, it's very common for us to ask, what is your gender? It's very common for us to ask, what's your age, and bracket those ages. Oftentimes we ask where you're from, we ask your education status. We very rarely ask what language you speak. And that's a bit odd if you think about it, because knowing what language you speak is a pretty essential component to figuring out how to provide support for this person. In the first place, if we didn't know what language they speak, we might not even have sent the right enumerators to talk to them in the first place. They might speak a major language of a dominant lingua franca of the area, and the population that we're working with in this particular area might speak a minority language or a different marginalized language. So part of what we see as the effect of this is that we don't then therefore factor language into our budgets or our planning. We often overassume the dominance of lingua francas. So you could look at a country like Mozambique, where we overassume maybe that that Portuguese is understood by everyone. When we look at actual data from the census, for example, I think it's less than 50% understand Portuguese in spoken format. So it's a very eye-opening experience once you see this data and once you can start to realize kind of some of our assumptions that we might have don't hold truth. And then what that leads to is we don't factor it into our staff recruitment. We might we might translate things without the right support for it. We might translate things into languages that aren't as necessary as other languages for a particular region of a country. That's very common when we do national surveys. A country like DRC has very distinct regional languages that are spoken in different parts of the country. So if we translate Swahili content, but we're targeting in Equator right now in Western DRC, it's a Lingala speaking territory. So we have to keep that in mind as we're planning and resourcing. And really the end effect or the impact of what this is it means that speakers of marginalized languages often can't talk to us. We often don't hear from them. So a lot of our data can be biased in that fact. If we're looking at lingua francas, once again, our research at TWV has found mostly that lingua francas are spoken primarily by men, they're spoken by educated, they're spoken by people in urban areas. So what that means is we're missing out on women, we're missing out on elderly, we're missing out on children, we're missing out on people in rural areas. And so we need to make sure that we're accountable to all those populations. The second trend is that language bias is often overlooked. So we think through this sort of cycle of data collection. And this is the one I'd say in the preparation phase where we often think, okay, this is where language comes into a factor, right? We need to translate our survey. And this is definitely an important component of it, but it's one of the components of it. And I think what we'd like to see is moving towards an area where we're factoring language into all the different elements of data collection. The first one I just talked about, planning, that's evaluating your needs, that's knowing what languages are spoken in that area. Obviously, we should be translating surveys, but then we also need to be testing those during our pilot stage. So we need to be testing whether our enumerators comprehend the words that are being used. When we've done research on this in Northeast Nigeria and some other places, we found that enumerators on average could understand anywhere from 10% to 80% of the words that they're being asked to understand in a survey. That's a big range, right? And if an enumerator doesn't understand the actual words that they're being asked to translate or asked to convey, then the end results of quality of your data is limited. And I think some other the panelists will talk about that a bit later. And so it really just needs to sort of, we need to factor language into the entire life cycle of this. I think the third trend that I've noticed, and this is especially true in COVID times, is that enumerators are asked to do so much. Like we put such a burden on enumerators. We look at them to be not just the one that are administering a survey, but they're an interpreter as well at the same time. They also have to somehow be an expert in the sector or the program that they're trying to discuss and enumerate. They have to be a representative of your organization, or the face of your organization sometimes. They have to be a cultural mediator. Sometimes the questions they're being asked to speak are difficult or sensitive, and they have to sort of bridge that cultural divide to make sure that people feel comfortable with what they're saying. And they have to be a translator as well. And from our standpoint, what we'd really like to move towards is a place where we take some of the language burden off of the enumerators. It's a lot to try to find this profile of a person, and especially when everyone's looking for this person, and especially when our budgets are tight for enumerators, like this profile is a very expensive, difficult to find person. And so if we can do some, come up with some strategies to take a bit of the translation or a bit of the interpreting burden off of enumerators, it frees up options, it frees up our recruitment possibilities, it frees up the demand that we're asking for from enumerators as well. And this is I would say more of a new trend, but that unstructured data is really difficult to use. This has always been the case. We've always asked questions such as, and when I talk about unstructured data, I mean things like asking other in a survey, or an open-ended answer where you ask them for their opinion, you document the entire opinion. It could also be things like a key informant interview or focus group, where we have an entire sort of unstructured conversation or semi-structured conversation around a topic. and that we want to document that. It's really difficult to use that, especially if you want to use it well and carefully. Sometimes it involves transcribing, sometimes it involves a second layer of translating. And I think this is getting back to the Slido questions, what some people, think through. This is an example of a survey. It's got a simple other category in it. This is a survey, I think that was 15 different languages spread out over 12 different countries. Like, if you can start to see the complexity of doing this, there's different scripts, different characters, there's Burmese, there's Malay, there's Bahasa Indonesian, there's Arabic. Like, this gets really complicated to try to analyze and to decipher this. And there's also open-ended questions as well, and sometimes you're not even sure how they're going to answer them. You're not sure the scope of what they're going to provide in this type of answer, and so it makes it really difficult to not only just understand it, but then to analyze and code it, and then to fold that into your analysis. And this one's interesting to me because I think sometimes we talk about technology as sort of the savior of all of this, but sometimes technology is more of a burden than a solution. I'll just give a recent example in Nigeria of where we're working with a partner to do, fold audio collection into qualitative data analysis and doing a whole series of transcribing and translating on top of that to help improve the data quality. And part of it's just difficult to figure out, we have low bandwidth environments, and David can talk about this a bit more, but there's low bandwidth environments where you have a large audio file and you need to send that to somebody to transcribe. Like, that's not an easy task. It was like each phone that you recorded on or each audio recorder has a different format that they work in. That's not easy as well. So I think sometimes these become a burden when they don't, when we didn't really anticipate it to be. So that's all I have for now. I think we'll get into some more topics later. So I'm going to stop sharing here quick.
Thanks a lot, Eric. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you for setting the stage. I think we'll pass the floor now to David. And while he gets set up with his screen sharing, I invite all attendees to check out another poll question. This time we're asking you, what is the biggest language challenge you faced in data collection? And there's a few options for you to share from, and you can share multiple options. So I see somebody mentioning finding enumerators who speak the relevant local languages, also checking the quality of multilingual survey interviews. If any other of you want to provide an answer, please do so. Okay, so now translating surveys into local languages and checking the quality of survey interviews, as well as analyzing multilingual survey results, seem to be the most popular. But of course, they keep changing, so. Okay, so well, I'll leave the poll question open for you all to keep answering it. I think there's some answers definitely are up there with particularly translation and checking quality, which I think are interesting, and perhaps our panelists can comment on those later on in the discussion. But I'll pass on to David now, so that we can hear from his experience and Mercy Corps' experience as an operational agency trying to deal with some of these language challenges. Over to you, David. I think you're still muted, David.
Okay. Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, loud and clear.
All right. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. So I'll just build on from what Eric has already begun. I think Eric set a very wonderful foundation to the whole discussions for today. I'll just try to throw some bit of more highlight in relations to my experience with in Uganda and also in Nigeria, as I'll try to share why language really matters and what is the safe landing option for this. So I just want to begin the conversation that when we talk about language, the use of language in data collection, I think it takes us a little bit back more in trying to understand that this is really very embedded within cultures, histories, and behaviors. When we try to think about it from that perspective, for instance, a region like the Northeast or even Karamoja region in Uganda, or even generally setting where we are implementing different activities, culture is really very essential in understanding, in basically understanding the use of language in our day-to-day lived experiences and how we interpret certain key aspects within our operational environment. And so looking at it, for instance, from an experience from Uganda, we looked at, we're doing a strategic resilience assessment where we're trying to unpack the definitions of wealth, what people understand as wealth or vulnerability in their layman understanding. And we as implementers, experts in humanitarian programming, thinking that we understand it best. And when we reach down to the the grassroots and try to understand from their perspective, a man who is living in a grass thatched house and living in a grass thatched house, and you may think he's a very poor man, but he won't consider himself poor. The people in the community won't consider him poor, simply because of the way we try to interpret certain words like this. So how can we be able to understand how certain languages and certain words are being used within cultures and within histories to better understand what the realities really mean? I picked one of the examples also. We did a strategic resilience assessment for the Northeast in Borno, where we're trying to look at different shocks and stresses within the Northeast. Words like floods, as experts, we understand what floods means. But when you try to look at this in the language of Kanuri or Hausa, what does this mean? And the interpretations here, you can see that it talks about disasters of water. But that is the lay interpretation of flood, the lay interpretation of the Kanuri word. When we talk about climate change, as experts, we try to have our own meanings attached to it, but what does that in real sense mean to the local context? So this is some of the conversation we kind of start thinking about as researchers or data collectors, making sure that meanings to such words are not lost in terms of how we design questions or how we collect, when we're collecting data, what meanings are generated from that. So basically, culture influences our everyday use of language. And so as data collectors or researchers or humanitarian or development intervention workers, what does that mean for us? And so how can we, over time, or as we kind of design tools and data collection process and analysis, deconstruct the notion of language as we ensure that we are doing really proper data collection. Similar scenarios, still I have talked about these scenarios, for instance, in the Karamoja region. We know Karamoja is almost like Northeast, where we have had series of NGOs, more than 200 NGOs in those areas for the last 20 years, implementing development work or humanitarian emergency response. But over the years, you don't see a lot of tangible impact in terms of what is happening. And simply because Karamoja in itself has a wide varieties of, yes, they may say they're Karamojans, but there are a lot of dialects, there are a lot of tribes within the settings, and the languages they use in everyday meanings to kind of interpret different case scenarios within their environment are all very diverse. I'll pick some of these keywords like apalago, which means a state of vulnerability. And this varies across the different dialects. As we collect data, how do these people interpret this as a way in which they understand when you're talking about building resilience within communities? Can we begin, understanding some of these keywords that they use to better, design interventions or ways in which we can better support such kind of vulnerable communities without necessarily changing the way in which they live? And this is very important when we talk about data collection and language in these cases. Well, we understand there are a lot of factors that really affect data collection. Eric has already pointed to some of the key challenges. Language sensitivity, language differences, cultural differences are all very key aspects of, of course, alongside other things to do with cost and time, ethics, and all those things. But what I want to point out here is that a lot of times language considerations are only made during tool designs or during data collections. We forget about it during analysis and other really very important stages. So the process really has to start with right from the question design, but of course very informed by the context, the areas where you're implementing, and other things to do with the cost as we think about the day-to-day, contextualization of these different languages. And we struggle a lot when we get to such kind of points of data collection or tool designs. Which language do we need to use over the other? You talk of Kanuri, you talk of Hausa, but when you get down to these localized, areas, you may understand actually that Kanuri is actually having a lot of dialects within it. And when we even add the aspect to do with how the new generations have gone to kind of use different kind of slangs or, in terms of the language we use in day-to-day interactions, it's also very, very different. But most importantly, these things to do with language or use of language in data collection is mostly prioritized by academia and not necessarily for a regular kind of, person who is normally we could call them enumerators or even field assistants and all that. Those things are not kind of important to them. It's we, the implementers, who impose these things that, we need to translate these things into this language. That's why when we get to the training, yes, it's one thing, somebody speaking a language, and it's another thing, writing a language, it's another thing. There's, being able to read and question somebody or ask informed questions in the right way in which somebody can be able to, provide correct answers. So for me, one of the gaps that we kind of keep thinking and we need to question ourselves is how can language really affect our ability to generate quality data? So these are kind of food for thought questions we have to be thinking about. And of course, as we think about what language we should be able to use to make sense of it. So I'll just point out that from a Mexico perspective, and I do know this is common across most other agencies as well, that I'll talk about it from 3 levels in terms of how we currently practice the use of language in data collection. When you classify kind of research focused type of data collection, and most times this kind of research focused data collection needed, it's a project usually that stretch a bit of a long period of time, 6 months, a year, when you have a very rigorous research, where you don't just say, we want to collect data within 7 days and be complete. So most cases in this kind of research focused studies, language becomes an essential part of the design on the tool and spending more time. We've seen examples of some of the projects we've implemented in the Northeast, where we're targeting to increase acceptance of former armed opposition group members. We collected data from a sample of over 3,800 within 2 weeks of translation in Hausa and Kanuri. It spends time, to kind of, and this is not a small program, this was a 1-year program. So meaning you have time to really do a good translation and spend quality time making sure that, translating different languages. Of course, the strategic resilience assessment we also did, spent about 1 week translating tool. This was a 6-month project, research project, but it was a very high level strategic kind of research, just trying to understand the different shocks and stresses and how different households cope with the different shocks and stresses within the Northeast, but most especially understanding the different capacities that households have within their areas to cope with shocks and stresses. Again, we have pilot related researches, which are very deep level type of research. We are implementing more of a action research project, and this is usually not short time frame. We spent about almost a month translating these tools. I think we're working very close with Translators Without Borders to translate this, about 4 different tools, the consent forms and all that, translating it into Hausa and Kanuri. These are kind of projects that really gives you enough time, and you also budgeted it well, in advance, talking about, cost and all that. All these are things which are well thought in right from the beginning or from the design. We also have certain cases where we are piloting certain platforms. Like we piloted the Yafe app, which was more of like kind of a platform that was to help, communities and people living within conflict affected areas to be able to identify hate speech as part of the peace building, processes. Recently, we're also piloting the chatbot. We did one in Uganda where we're using what we call gamified technology for smallholder farmers to improve access to information, digital information, basically. These are kind of platforms that already allows you to translate some of these informations or whatever into the local language, that either in terms of voice and all that, that makes it very easy for data collections. Same thing with when we're talking about using, interactive voice, response. So these are very kind of high level where we intentionally make the use of language and interpretations of language in terms of when we're going for data collection. When you look at it at the medium level, the medium usage, we talk about, for instance, large scale surveys, baseline, midline, end-line evaluations. These are more like kind of short time frame, kind of things, where when you start thinking about translating tools, it's most cases you just translate it when you're coding the form and say, okay, we have the English question and then the labels are, or the hints appearing in the local language. But the question is, do we have enough time to train these enumerators? Again, Eric has mentioned these things already earlier. Do we have enough time to train enumerators to be able to interpret this very well? We have certain words in certain languages that are even hard for enumerators to read, let alone, speaking it. They could speak fluently, but when it comes to reading those words, are very difficult. So those kind of things affect the quality of data, simply because we don't have enough time that we put into some of these kind of, data collection aspects. Then, of course, the low or even non-usage are mostly like this kind of quick type of data collections, like we're doing post-distribution monitoring. It's even easier for post-distribution monitoring because there's a frequency in which you collect the data and you may use the same tool over time. So you try to make sure that you translate tools that, in different languages to make sure that data collection is more comprehensive. But when you're trying to do like kind of quick or rapid type of assessments, this you try to say that you don't have enough time to translate the tools to collect data. Talk about participant registration. This is where oftentimes we miss a lot of things, especially when we're talking about the disabled population who probably don't speak or don't hear, and yet we're translating tools in different languages, but we don't look at those kind of quiet type of language spoken by disabled people who don't hear. And oftentimes these are people who are left out of intervention simply because there is no way you've spoken with them and, and being able to understand. We don't have expertise within our teams who are good in sign languages and all that kind of things and speaking with those kind of people. So oftentimes they're left alone simply because you cannot collect information from them using any type of language you definitely want. Well, there are different challenges already. Eric has pointed so many of them. I think I'll just pick maybe a couple of them, if any. Some of them has to do with, for instance, how to adapt tools, and when you're talking about shifting focus, when you're doing kind of a rolling-based kind of data collection, where oftentimes in the middle you have to keep adapting to tools and all that. Already, you don't have the expertise to translate language within your teams. You have maybe you're hiring or you're trying to outsource the translator. How do you manage translating languages when your tool or data collection process are in a rolling basis? Maybe tools are even being adapted as you go along. So these are kind of typical challenges that definitely comes in. One which is also very essential is that language usually loses meaning when you're doing secondary data analysis. We've had secondary reviews when you're designing new proposals or programs, or even intervention that you want to go and explore different information, but you don't want to rush collecting tons of data, again, primary data. There are already a lot of data available out there, but either this secondary information don't tell you the processes in which all the kind of languages that were used to really be able to collect those different information, to present them in ways that you can better relate it to the language in which it was collected. Because secondary information, most times when you're going through it, quite loses a lot of the ground truthing, unless you go and do a bit more validation and all that. And then, of course, I think one other key piece that I will talk about is provincialism in data collection. Talking about conflicts with knowledge generation. We talk about enumerators who are already used to the local context. Anything that happens within the local context, and even if you've translated tool in the local language, most times when they are interviewing, if you listen to the recordings against the field notes that whatever is recorded or taken, they differ significantly, simply because a lot of the people we train, or we think we've trained them to use the local language to collect data, tend to bring in their own kind of, their experiences, because they are so used to the culture. But if you look at someone who has not been within the setting and maybe trying to collect different information. Because of that lack of familiarity with the local context, they tend to pay more attention or tend to put more emphasis in making sure that they probe and unearth a lot more information compared to someone who is already so used to the context, who over time may even go ahead and try to put the options or answers, questions based on what they understand within the context, which may not be a representation of the respondents actually providing those information. A lot of these are already, I think Eric has already talked about, but as we go along, I will definitely be able to respond to any questions. I want to say thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, David. That was super thorough and very interesting. And I think your point around, jargon and using words that actually resonate with people's concerns and that people are actually familiar with, and to describe the challenges and the issues that they're facing is a very a point that really resonated with me and an interesting one. Thank you for that. I want to flag to all attendees again that there's a couple more poll questions for you as we get ready to hear from the next speaker. Nayana, if you want to start sharing your screen.
Absolutely.
Great.
Do you see it?
I do, yes.
Are we waiting for the poll, or should I?
Yeah, so I think we can I think in the interest of time, perhaps you can get started, and I see answers to the poll coming in, and I'll share them in the chat, the results in the chat, so you can all see them later. Please go ahead.
Great.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Right, hello everyone. Hope you're all staying safe and healthy during this strange times. So yeah, I'm going to just pick up on what Eric and David have already touched upon, and share a bit really some experiences from our side as Impact in terms of factoring in language into data collection. Very quickly, just to give a bit of background on why I'm sharing experiences from Impact or who we are. We are a research organization. We do a lot of primary data collection in a range of humanitarian development contexts, a lot of different operating environments. Currently, I think we're implementing about 500 research projects across 25 different contexts, primarily in the Middle East and Africa. So just to say that, of course, it's constantly something we have to factor in, a lot of different environments, and something that I'll share a bit more about in a second. So probably to reiterate a bit the obvious, so why from our experiences, I think language and data collection are kind of inseparable in that sense. So one, I think has already been touched upon quite a bit, is really the clarity of language that's used and the implications that has for data quality. This also obviously has implications, and I think David touched upon this towards the end, on how inclusive your data collection exercise is going to be. Who are you going to be able to actually interview, include, if you make sure that your language of data collection is as inclusive as possible. Again, to flag, and I think has already been covered, but the language of data collection doesn't just stop with the translation, right? And I'll come back to some lessons learned on this in a couple of minutes. The second aspect, I think, something that we have been seeing more and more over the past couple of years, is really just collecting some very basic data about languages within needs assessment. So going a bit beyond needs assessment, just asking about humanitarian needs, but also looking a bit into communication needs, information sharing preferences, and how, of course, language becomes a key factor when you start looking at this. And this allows for a bit more of a nuanced needs analysis, if you will, and more inclusive response planning. And I'll show a few examples of this from some recent assessments we've done. So one is, this is from earlier this year, some analysis our team in South Sudan produced specifically to inform the humanitarian community's risk communication strategies for COVID-19. So quite a few different takeaway points. It looked broadly at communication and information needs, but if you look specifically at some of the language data, you will see, of course, within each of the different states, there is always a difference between the preferred language for receiving spoken communications versus receiving written communications, with English often coming up as the most preferred for written communications, but almost never for spoken communications. And then also, interestingly, there are specific states where you don't see a clear majority in terms of which language is the preferred spoken or preferred written language, right? So this means in some states, okay, there is clearly a preference for across majority of the population for which one is the preferred written language, which is the preferred spoken communication strategy is quite clear there. In some other states, it needs to be a bit more nuanced because you can have 30% of the population which prefers to receive written communication in this language, another 30% in another language, another 30% in another language, and so on and so forth. So this is kind of some data we provided to support risk communication strategies right at the start of this year towards February, March. Another example from a recent needs assessment in Bangladesh, where we see that generally communication with communities is coming up as a kind of issue. So in general, households that we assessed report that they are able to provide feedback and complaints, but almost never were consulted in the delivery or design of humanitarian assistance, or did not feel like they were consulted. Interestingly, when you look specifically at the disaggregation by households that reported they have at least one member that speaks English or Bangla, they tend to report more that they felt like they were consulted. So you can see here that in this specific instance, consultations about needs preferences of humanitarian aid assistance could be impacted by language as a key barrier. Another example here from Afghanistan. Again, this was a rapid communication needs assessments that our team had done to support also COVID risk communication strategies in Afghanistan. And there was, again, a lot of different aspects of communication and information needs that was covered. But if you zoom in a bit into some of the language data, like the analysis shows that, okay, of course, as you'd expect, across the different regions, there's a difference in what is the most preferred language for receiving written and verbal and written communication. But then also interestingly, up until the time of data collection, the information that had been received seems to almost always have been in the preferred language. So in that sense, there's no discrepancy, at least for the most part. Of course, we're talking about majority here. We're not talking about the highlights you're seeing is basically what's reported by majority of the population. So just some like interesting trends and analysis that can come up with some basic language information. Now, that's established, so language and data collection are quite key to one another. I just want to share some key lessons learned. Again, there's a lot of challenges both Eric and David had touched upon. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but really focus on a few from our own experiences across different contexts. So first, obviously, translation of your data collection tools is extremely challenging, especially if it hasn't been budgeted into the cost of data collection, which tends to happen a lot in our case as well. And then this obviously impacts your accuracy of data collection. Obviously, I mean, apart from the fact that the tools have to be translated, if you think that the translation hasn't been done properly, if you're concerned that it's been done too quickly, one thing we often find that could be quite helpful just before piloting the tool, having it back translated, even if it's just from someone else in the team who speaks the language, just having it back translated into the original language, and then you kind of start noticing where things have gotten lost in translation. And something that I think Eric touched upon, but not for the entire survey, but just some keywords which if you are a researcher designing your data collection tool, you're concerned could be easily lost in translation as part of the training of your data collection teams, just having a kind of comprehension testing essentially. And we found even things that seem quite easy or straightforward, like safety and security incidents, can get quite easily lost in translation. And of course, if your enumerators aren't being able to understand what we mean by safety and security when they ask this question and have to explain a bit to the respondents, then you're going to have some issues with the data that comes in. Another kind of challenge or lesson learned, but quite specific to I guess, at least in our case, very few contexts, specifically in Bangladesh, when you're working with with the population, when your data collection involves a population whose primary spoken language, in this case Rohingya, has no commonly agreed script, right? So there's no commonly agreed way or formalized way, if you will, of transliterating your data collection tools. Now, what we did, our team last year did a small pilot exercise to look into this specifically, and I'm not going to go into the details because you can find the publication from this on our website. But to highlight a few things, what they found useful from this context, obviously, again, maybe stating the obvious, but bilingual data collection teams, but not in the sense of just bilingual in that sense. You'd always have to have an enumerator who is fluent in spoken Rohingya, but is also, for the tool that will be written in either in the Burmese, Bangla, or English script, has to be fluent in one of those three, right? So they can understand the script, they can explain it spoken fluently to the refugee population at the time that we were working with, and they're also able to comprehend quite clearly the written version of the tool that you've provided them. Something that we did provide, and eventually wasn't used a lot actually, but for some of the more complex questions, audio translations within Kobo. So there is a feature within Kobo where you can have a recording. When we debriefed back with the enumerators, they did say that they didn't always use it, especially because of like the time they were spending on the survey already. But it did prove helpful more towards the start of the data collection when they were not yet familiar with the questions that were coming up. So this kind of feature, they would find it useful to just listen in on a question if they read it, they didn't understand, listen to it and try to understand how they should be explaining that to the data collection teams. And there are a few other lessons that you will find in this publication, which is on our website. Another lesson, again, when you work specifically in multilingual context. So in our case, this example specifically is from Northeast Nigeria. David's spoken quite extensively on it already. For us, this is more like logistical challenges, I guess, to have teams that will be qualified to run large-scale surveys, who will be trained, who have the experience in it, but also have the required language skills, specifically when you go down to different community levels. Some things we've tried to do, obviously making sure that when we started planning out our first data collection exercises in Northeast Nigeria, it was about 2 or 3 years ago, looking a bit into data that is available. So what tends to be like the most commonly spoken or language in these different LGAs that we're trying to assess across these different populations. So not to forget about that, obviously, when you start in a new context. And of course, trying to localize the recruitment of your data collection team. So in our case, that would mean if we didn't have a direct presence, instead of trying to spend additional resources locating the perfectly trained enumerator with the perfect language skills, try to partner up with local partners who are already present in these areas, who probably already have teams that are fluent in the language that you're looking for. But you would just need to divert your resources in that case for training on data collection. So we do quite a bit of our data collection, of course, through with thanks to a lot of local partners who help us reach populations in areas where we may not have a direct field presence. And then finally, something specifically that comes up for COVID, obviously, needs assessments, or at least the needs assessments we work on, whether they're sectoral or multi-sectoral, they are already extremely long. So some of our multi-sectoral needs assessments can be between 30 to 40 minutes. And if you have enumerators doing trying to do between 8 to 10 surveys a day, that's a lot. So of course, sometimes questions about language or about communication are the ones that are compromised, right? So you're saying, we need the questions about the household hunger scale, we need the questions about food security. The last part of the questionnaire will need to be removed just for the sake of time. But I mean, it doesn't have to be something really extensive. Like there are these 4 questions that our colleagues from Translators Without Borders had recommended to us a while ago. And most of the analysis examples I've shown you are just based on those 4 questions. At maximum, they will add maybe 2 minutes, 4, maybe 2 to 4 minutes to your survey. But they can already allow you to do some additional analysis, some more nuanced needs analysis if you're looking at communication and information needs of the population. I think I will stop there. Yes, that's it. But I hope that was helpful, and I look forward to any questions or further discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nayana. That was super helpful, at least for me, and really interesting to see the diversity of solutions or and learning that you were able to share from your experience. So before we jump into the next presentation, there's another poll question for you all attending, asking if you have incorporated any of the 4 questions that Nayana just mentioned at the end of our presentation now, to understand what languages people speak at home and people's preferences around around communication and language. So I see some people responding yes, some people responding no, and some people saying not sure. Actually, at the moment, the majority of you are saying that you have not used these questions. So it will be interesting to also perhaps discuss a little bit that further in the discussion. After our next presentation, which is from Chloe, so from more of a I guess research and policy influencing perspective. So Chloe, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mia. I think you can all see my screen by now, hopefully. I'll try and keep it short so we've got lots of time for some questions afterwards. So as Mia mentioned during the introduction, I'm Chloe and I work for the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre. I work in the policy and research team, and since I joined IDMC about 3 years ago, we've done research in Iraq, Colombia, Nigeria, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar, and I'm definitely forgetting a few, Niger. So I displayed some of the languages on the screen that we've had to contend with during data collection. And as you can imagine, I personally do not speak all of these languages. So we have often had to operate through teams of local enumerators or with local consultants who will then hire the enumerators themselves. So I thought it would be interesting just for this final presentation to focus a little bit on some of the lessons learned and reflections based on this sort of cooperation with enumerators over the past few years. And I can definitely agree with what Eric said at the beginning, which is that we often expect our enumerators to do too much, and I'm definitely guilty of that as well. So the first story I wanted to share was based on the research we did in Northeast Nigeria. I think last year, although time is going strangely at the moment. So for this study, which looked at the relationship between internal displacement and cross-border movements, so people who were displaced inside their own country and people who crossed borders, we had cooperated actually with Translators Without Borders to translate our survey into Hausa and Kanuri in advance of data collection. So we thought we were doing it all properly. And I traveled to my degree myself to be part of the training with our enumerators, who were managed by a consultant that we'd recruited. But we rapidly encountered a few challenges. First of all, my enumerators couldn't understand my English, so it was retranslated into English again by our consultant, just showing that even when you do speak the same language, sometimes regional accents can make the same language unintelligible. And then we also found that although we translated the survey into Hausa and Kanuri, our enumerators were fluent in those languages, but they could not necessarily read them. Like Nayana was mentioning earlier, they were potentially their preferred spoken languages, but they weren't their preferred written languages. So the survey that we had translated into Hausa and Kanuri was actually, well, for all effects and purposes, essentially useless. So we had to retranslate the tools from English into spoken Hausa or spoken Kanuri during the training, and we spent quite a lot of time going through the English version to make sure that people understood what translation they should use in the 2 local languages we were using. But whether or not everyone was then using the same translations during data collection, I don't know. So it was already very interesting to find that even with the best intentions, when you translate a survey, even your enumerators who will speak the language of the participants may not necessarily be able to read it. So that was an interesting lesson for us already. Then we had some data quality issues. Thanks to Translators Without Borders, we actually recorded, transcribed, and then translated quite a few of the interviews that were conducted. And thanks to that, we discovered that sometimes the enumerators weren't necessarily asking the questions properly. I think the enumerators understood the local context very well, so sometimes they took liberties and adjusted the survey questions the way they thought was most appropriate for the context, but which meant that the survey questions weren't identical for all the respondents. And we also found some discrepancies between the transcripts and the survey responses. You can see an example up here. The interview transcript says, do you want to go back? Yes, I want to. When do you want to go back? At any time when the peace reigns. But in the survey data, at any time when the peace reigns was translated into within the next month. So that was problematic, of course. And we ended up actually using the recording translations as qualitative data instead of relying too heavily on the survey data that we realized was unfortunately heavily flawed. And it was thanks to this quality assurance process, thanks to the recordings and the transcriptions, that we were able to become aware of that. Although actually today I'm working on a different study, also in Nigeria, and we adopted a similar process. This is just purely qualitative research this time around. And this time I've discovered some problems with the transcription. So even when you do record your interviews and have them transcribed and translated, sometimes you need to do some quality assurance on the transcriptions as well as the initial stage of the process. So lots of challenges to be taken into account in all the different stages, from the translation of the survey to the training to the actual data collection to the transcription, and then later to the analysis. Another example I thought would be interesting to focus on is a similar study that we did on the Thai-Myanmar border. Now, this time we didn't translate the research tools ahead of time. We would have needed to translate them into Karen and Burmese, and we just didn't have the capacity at that time. So we went ahead with the tools in English, knowing that the partner we were cooperating with, which is called the Border Consortium, would be able to support us with the translations in person during data collection. So we practiced these translations in training, spent a lot of time going over what the appropriate phrasing for different concepts would be. And that seemed to be going okay. So I'm hopeful that we didn't have too many problems with that during the data collection. And I think if we didn't have any issues with that, it is because we dedicated a lot of time in training to this process of deciphering, understanding, and translating the tools in advance of data collection. We did have an issue with one enumerator who couldn't read English, unfortunately. We discovered this a bit late, but our partner decided to translate the tools into Burmese for him on paper. So our enumerator would have the phone with the survey questions in English that he couldn't read and the Burmese translation on paper. And amazingly, he actually did quite well. He was the subject of constant quality assurance by his colleagues and by our partner, and it worked out quite well. But obviously that's something that we would need to avoid, because in an ideal world, that's something that just shouldn't happen. But unfortunately, these are problems that we do sometimes encounter during data collection. And then just reflecting upon the fact that we ask enumerators to do too much, we asked our enumerators to provide short written summaries of the interviews that they conducted. I thought it would be a helpful way of having a little bit of additional qualitative data to accompany the survey responses. So some of our enumerators who had better levels of English wrote these notes directly in English, and the others wrote them in Burmese, and we later got those Burmese versions translated by volunteers. But in both cases, either the notes in Burmese or the notes in English, they weren't necessarily as useful as I had hoped they would be. And this could have been because of limited literacy in either language. It could also have been simply that this wasn't a skill that the enumerators necessarily had, or it could have been because they were doing surveys in not necessarily very comfortable situations. They just didn't have time to sit down and write out nice handwritten notes after every single interview they conducted. So in retrospect, we shouldn't have expected them to also collect qualitative data while they were conducting survey interviews in different locations across multiple days. So we've got lots of other examples we could have drawn upon. I think it was Eric who mentioned earlier that in Mozambique, a lot of people don't speak Portuguese. Well, I discovered that in Niger, a lot of people don't speak French. So I arrived naively expecting to be able to support the team of enumerators and conduct a few interviews myself. That didn't happen. Likewise, we had some challenges while we were doing research in Iraq. We translated the tools into Arabic. We recruited Arabic-speaking enumerators, obviously, but some of our respondents were Kurdish. I hadn't thought of that. So again, something that could have been resolved with a little bit more forward thinking on my side in terms of the languages to be expected during data collection. And then there's the case of Afghanistan. So for Afghanistan, we asked our consultant, who would be leading the data collection, to translate the survey into Dari and Pashto ahead of data collection, which he did. But the problem is I have no way of back translating Dari or Pashto. We don't have any Dari or Pashto speakers in the office. So how reliable the translations were, I simply don't know. And on the flip side of the coin, when our research team in Afghanistan wrote other responses in either language, well, I can't read them. Google Translate seems to do a fair job, but how reliable is Google Translate? And honestly, will you always take time to translate all your other responses? And how often, if you do translate them, will these other responses actually be useful? So is this perhaps more of a burden on the enumerators who have to rapidly enter text into their phones as they're conducting the data collection? Maybe it's more of a burden than a benefit for the future analysis. I'm not sure. To be determined, a question that we should ask ourselves. So yeah, a few lessons learned or reflections for further thought. First of all, as I've learned to, after a few mistakes, you need to think carefully about which languages you'll need. Don't just think about the dominant language or even the dominant languages. Don't just assume that people in Niger will speak French. Don't assume that everyone you interview in Iraq will speak Arabic. Equally, if you're translating your tools in advance, maybe question the accuracy of the translations. Like Nayana said, if you can have them back translated, fantastic. If you can't, then what does that mean for the quality of your data? Do you really trust that they've been translated accurately, and how can you check that? Third, don't overestimate the literacy of your enumerators, either in their own language or in your language. And this goes for both written and spoken. Do they understand the tools properly, and can they provide written notes? And should they be providing written notes, given that you've recruited enumerators, not research assistants who will be conducting qualitative interviews? If you're asking them to do too much, is that realistic? And will the extra work that they produce actually be useful to you, or will it just be an additional burden to them during their work? Think about whether or not you have the ability to translate these other responses and how useful they'll actually be. Is it actually worth the hassle for the enumerators of writing it down in full, the hassle for you to have these responses translated? Will there actually be a benefit to this? And then finally, of course, where possible, record, transcribe, and translate the interviews for quality assurance. As we did in the first case in Nigeria, it was essential. I mean, without the transcriptions and the translations, we wouldn't have realized there was a problem with the data. And the benefit is that you can also use these recordings and their translations as qualitative data, which is an added bonus. Although, as I discovered today, you do also have to do some quality assurance on the transcriptions themselves. So there is always further challenges to take into consideration when it comes to multilingual settings. And I think on that note, I will stop here, and I look forward to some interesting discussions in the group. Mia, you're muted still.
You're on mute, Mia.
Of course I am. I'm just saying, thank you. Thank you, Chloe, for such a humbling and honest presentation. I really appreciate it. And yeah, lots of food for thought, I think, for the conversation now. We do have one more poll question for you all attending, which is asking sort of like a follow-up on Chloe's last point around quality assurance. How often do you verify survey translations when you're translating into local languages and also when you're translating results back from local languages, as Chloe was just describing? So about 60% of you are saying sometimes, a few are saying rarely, and a few are saying never. Somebody very often. So that's great.
Mia, can I just add quick, because
yeah.
Chloe brought up a solution that we often advocate for, and Chloe and I have written about this, and we can share that blog that we wrote about audio recording as a verification tool. And I think from the sound of it, it's really scary. A lot of people I talk to about this say like, there's no way I have resources for that. And just to reiterate, when we did this with Chloe's team, we transcribed and translated a tiny sample of the overall recordings. And I think that's something that I always just have to mention to people, because it's not going to necessarily be hundreds of hours of transcription. It can be it could be 5%, it could be 2%. You could spot check, you could just transcribe certain questions that you are concerned about. There's lots of ways that you can use it as a verification tool that don't have to be super daunting afterwards. So just thought I'd mention it. It was a great learning experience for us. There's some technical challenges, like we mentioned earlier, in just getting the recordings to work and sharing them and things like that. But some of those over the next actually year or two will be addressed. I know there's some projects underway, even amongst like the team at Kobo, for example, if you use Kobo for your surveys, that are working on integrating audio data collection directly into the forms. So stay tuned for that, but there's some good innovations coming in this space. So.
Thank you, Eric. That's a great point. So I just before opening it up for question and answers from everybody, I just want to give 1 minute to you all, panelists, having sort of like listened to each other and having brought up some really interesting points. What's the most important? Like, if there's like one practical thing that organizations should be doing if they're taking seriously language challenges into account in data collection, what would that one thing be? And I'll give 1 minute to each of you, perhaps going in the reverse order to how you just spoke. So Chloe, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. I think from my perspective, the most important thing we could do is to budget for this already ahead of data collection. If it hadn't been for Translators Without Borders, who kindly did it for free for us, we wouldn't have had the budget at the time to do the transcriptions and the translations of those select numbers of recordings we conducted in Nigeria. And it's incredibly valuable. I think we've learned from that. And I think we just simply need to make sure we include not just budget in terms of money, but also budget in terms of time into the project planning. So we're able to have tools translated, we're able to have some recordings transcribed and translated, and we're really able to use that in the data collection.
Thank you. Nayana, what's your one thing in 1 minute?
I was going to say budget, so Chloe stole my answer. But then I think if I have to add a second thing, I would say what I was mentioning about like more nuanced needs analysis. So coming out of this mindset where you think about needs assessments and analysis specifically about very concrete practical needs, which of course it is, but also start thinking about communication and information needs because so much of it is related to actually being able to address needs of crisis affected populations. Yeah.
Great, thank you. David, what from your side?
I think issue that the budget was cutting across for all of us because that was one of the things I would talk about. But Nayana made mention something around, working with local organizations and all that. For me, I would think that in addition to kind of building also local expertise among our enumerators, more intentionally looking at how can we reinforce their abilities to really do more quality kind of, translations or quality interpretations. I think this is where we can invest some bit more time on trying to identify not every enumerators you work with, but there are those who are really strong among the teams whom you can empower them more around those kind of skills. So I think we could invest more time around that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, great point. And Eric, anything to add to that?
Yeah, they're all really good points. I think maybe one good one that I always advocate for that's a low-hanging fruit is just including a basic question around language in your data collection. I know Nayana shared the 4 questions that we often advocate for. Amongst that 4, the top one on the list, I would say, is if you could only fit one thing in, just try to fit that one. The question, how it's worded is, or that how we propose to word it is, what is the main language you speak at home? It's a very simple question. It doesn't get you the entire puzzle. There's still some nuance, and maybe you don't read that language, maybe you prefer a different language, but it really helps get you closer to being better informed about what needs you have. It helps you plan for what enumerators you're going to need to organize for that data collection. Maybe the next round you're more prepared. It helps you can disaggregate your data. Like Nayana showed some great examples of just a basic disaggregation by language to show actually it's not just that feedback mechanisms are failing, or but it's that half the people, it's because they didn't have it available in a language that they could understand that they weren't able to access that. That's invaluable resources because it actually gives you something that you can action upon instead of just saying we need better feedback mechanisms. Now we kind of know why. So that's the one I always advocate for. It's a fairly simple question to fold in, just like you ask what's your gender, what's your age. It should just be as simple as that as well. So.
Great, thank you. I think those are all great points, and I hope that that they were clear to our attendees. But I would like to open now the floor for questions from you all. So if there are any questions, you can write them in the chat. I don't know, Maeve, since you've helped with looking at the chat, have any questions already come in?
Yes, there's actually one from me.
Do you want to just speak it out?
Sure. So because you were all saying how important the budget side is, my question would be, to budget for it, the arguments also need to be clearly spelt out of the cost of not doing this or not integrating language properly in the activity. So I was just wondering if you had any powerful examples or figures from your experience on the topic that can be a good way to convince whoever's financing this.
Anybody wants to take it on? I think Chloe, you had some really nice examples in your transcriptions there.
I mean, the costs could just simply be to have to redo it all again. If the data quality is so bad that it's not usable, then one potential cost would be simply the entire cost of data collection. But that's an extreme example, and luckily for us it didn't come to that. We were able to use the transcriptions as qualitative data and make use of that instead. But if we really had been set on using the survey responses, then I guess we'd have had to do it again. So that would have been pretty expensive.
Yeah, indeed. Any other one? Yeah.
Yeah, I always add when this gets brought up, when the budget question gets brought up, I always challenge people to think about what's the cost of not budgeting for this in actual dollar amounts. And I think the reality when you start to put pen to paper and write it out is we realize that we internalize a lot of translation and language support in our normal team loads. So it's very common for translation, for example, of a survey to get put onto the junior M&E staff, or somebody in your office who's a finance person who just happens to speak that language gets roped into that. And we get it, like that's totally reasonable, and especially when we're all strapped for resources, but realize that has a cost to it. And I think if donors can appreciate that as well, it's a little bit easier sell to say, this is actually why we're asking for this little bit extra line item for translation, because this is really just taking up our resources, it's taking extra time for us to do. It's not always, translation doesn't always have to be an extra cost. Sometimes it's just make that cost explicit, like make that that resource explicit so that we know we're planning for it. And I think somebody brought up the time component. More than money, sometimes it's just time. Like sometimes we can find a way to do it with the resources, but we don't quite give ourselves enough time to do that. And that could be like we were cramming our survey content in at the last minute. It's a crisis, it's a rapid needs assessment, and it's got to go out in 2 days. Like, can you feasibly translate in 2 days? Like, we're a specialized translation organization, and usually the answer for us is no. So if we can't do that, sometimes others can't do that as well. And so just keep in mind, sometimes time is more valuable than anything else in this process.
Thank you, Eric. Anybody, Nayana or David, do you want to add anything to this question?
No, I think it's following what Chloe said. I mean, I'm sure we can draw up some figures of percentage of data points that had to be deleted or entire survey records, just simply because of, you know, accuracy issues. And luckily there was always a large buffer included. So, you know, we don't land up in a situation where the survey is ended and you have to start from scratch, but the buffer is additional costs, right? It's additional surveys that you could do without if the translation and understanding was done properly.
Right. And David, when you and I were speaking in preparation for the panel, you sort of mentioned your experience with trying to budget for language resources and not being able to do so. So having to do quite a bit of advocacy internally, perhaps not even just with external donors. Do you want to share anything around that?
Yeah, I think this is quite interesting, especially when you're looking at it. How do you advocate for that internally? For someone like me who is always at the forefront of, let's say, proposal designs and then leading the M&E aspects of that. So oftentimes it's easy to sell the idea to the proposal writers why this is important, and especially when you look at designs of certain programs and interventions, you definitely want to ensure that things to do with the M&E budget that concerns, for instance, data collection. You look at, if you think about the different type of assessment that you're going to collect or you're going to do within the program, and then you enlighten the writing teams and ensuring that they understand the importance of those kind of assessments and what kind of information you're going to be collecting. And so then you can kind of, in most cases, yes, it's very hard to kind of have a very definitive figure to say, because we're doing this number of assessments, and so this would be the cost of translating, for instance, in this assessment, and especially when you still don't have a clear sense of the magnitude of the tool, the volume of the information you're going to collect. And so it's very hard to kind of have a specific figure, but having people who can influence right from the design stage and you know, when you're drafting budget and making sure you emphasize the importance and the needs for why you have to include that. And I think one of the examples is narrating it in terms of the cost of time you spend, because for instance, it took us 2 months to translate to translate one of the like 4 different tools for one project. And this is a project which is 6 months. Now, if you spend 2 months in translating the tool, you already consume a lot of time within the program, meaning you still can't start data collection. You even haven't yet gone to train the people on the tool that you've translated. So all those kind of things, once you start selling the idea, then they start realizing the importance of why you actually allocate a certain, you know, lump sum to kind of manage those kind of costs. So thank you.
Thanks, David. That's a really lots of really good points there. We have a question from Rachel Factor, who asks, can you talk more about how you manage data analysis of written responses when there are maybe a lot of typos or misspellings or alternate spellings and those kinds of issues? It's not addressed to anyone of you in particular, but anyone wants to take it on.
I can, just because I've had many painful hours doing that myself. I think Chloe touched upon this, but in my experience, I found triangulation with the audio recording quite useful. So there was quite often where the transcript and the translated version of the transcript just was not enough. Like I couldn't do much in terms of analysis. So trying to triangulate that with the audio recording, but also debriefing with the data collection team to clarify parts of the audio recording that you want to. But I'm not sure if that's like, it was quite a time-consuming process, obviously.
And I think when it comes to simple things like where do you come from, the names of the cities, for example, or simple answers that still have to be written, I think it's just a matter of lengthy data cleaning. It just takes time. The filter option in Excel is usually good because you can usually figure out which ones look vaguely similar and then combine them into one. But I think when there are mistakes in the data, if it's something that's easy to fix, then it just needs to be fixed slowly, laboriously.
Fair point, indeed.
Yeah, I'd add a couple thoughts to that. I think where I've noticed this problem the most is when we're asking, this is once again getting onto what we ask the enumerators and data collection teams to do versus what we internalize in other or provide support for in other ways. And sometimes this happens the most when we're asking a data collection team to document a long open-ended answer on paper or typing out in person at the time of communication. That's a really challenging task. If you think about it, they have to, they're listening at the same time that they're trying to talk to somebody, at the same time that they're trying to manage a conversation and look at their notes for the next thing. It's a lot to document that perfectly verbatim. So if you have long answers where you're really looking for something in depth, which is great, we should not shy away from asking that type of question in a survey or in data collection exercises. Definitely having an audio recording is invaluable because it just takes some of the burden off of them. Maybe they could take shorthand notes in the survey tool, and then you have a transcription later where you can document the entire verbatim quote if that's what you're looking for. But expecting them to do that is difficult. And then the second piece I'd reiterate on that, once again, this is asking an enumerator not to be a translator necessarily. But if we ask that person to script their answer in English, they might not feel that comfortable writing in English. And that's a really, really tough challenge. And so if we allow them, I think somebody brought up, I can't remember who brought up the example of allowing their team to write, I think Chloe said this, write your feedback, write your open-ended responses in the language you feel most comfortable writing, and then we'll take on the burden of translating that afterwards. You'll find that the quality and the accuracy of what they write is much more precise. And so even if it's, I actually prefer to, I can read English, but I don't write it very well. I'd rather write in Hausa. Allow them to do that. And you'll find that I think the answers will be a little bit more precise.
Thank you. We have one more question asking how are you intentionally exploring language and reaching people with disabilities or other disadvantages, other people who are blind, deaf, or illiterate. David hinted to this in his presentation, but I don't know if you have anything else that you would like to add to this specifically, David, or anybody else.
Yeah, I think this is a very difficult aspect to do with. It sounds very easy, but for context, depends on also the context. Like for instance, here in the Northeast Nigeria, where we have, for instance, the deep field sites where we call them garrison towns. These are kind of locations where a lot of institutions are already kind of like broken down. And so when you go, for instance, to a location like Damboa, and you're trying to look, for instance, for an institution or an association that really handles or deals with disabled groups, you may not find that, because that would be like the easiest entry point. And so most times, even without intentionally doing so, you find those people are already excluded because you don't have a reference or a referral where you could just go and find who are the people who are trying to, provide or to kind of support and provide for these kind of groups of people. So in such kind of locations, you may not find them. So when you try to be intentional, even when you try to ask with the local leaders, there are certain settings where disabled people are really not just marginalized, but even ostracized. You just talking about asking for them, they would wonder why you're asking for this, even when that's your intention. So having those in your selection criteria or registration criteria to look for some of those particular people, to interview them or to kind of understand their specific needs, it's very difficult when you try to trace it within localized settings, simply because of the whole notions attached to that. But being intentional attempts to break those kind of barriers, where NGOs and leaders, especially when you go through the leaders, they will try to show you locations or households that have those kind of individuals. But it's even much harder, especially that I mentioned about like the deaf people. If you find them and you want to kind of speak with them, or you want to register them to benefit from certain services, you cannot understand their needs, because you, the person doing the registration, first of all, cannot use sign language to speak with them, to be able to record their details and information about them, except when you use a third person. You're not sure whether that third person may provide, they're all different dynamics within those settings, but it's quite not very easy to do that, though being very intentional about looking for those people and going through certain leaders rather than going through the local community people would be a way you can definitely reach out to such people and be able to communicate with them.
Thanks, David. I think that was a super thorough answer, and I think we're running out of time, so I'm afraid we'll have to start wrapping up now. There's definitely lots of interesting points that were raised, and thank you also for all your answers in the poll. There's one last poll question open, asking, what's the most important takeaway from this session for you and your organization? So this is an open text. Please do give us feedback. We greatly appreciate it. I've also shared my screen now, so if you want to get in touch with any of the speakers or find out more about some of the resources and the work mentioned in their presentations, you can check out the websites. Other than that, I think we can be signing off now. Maeve, are we good?
Yeah, we can give it a minute if you want, because when I sign off, I think people won't be able to answer.
We'll be able to answer the poll. Okay, so yeah, please do take some time to answer the poll. Thank you so much.
I'll just put one quick plug. I put a link in the chat for people who didn't see it. There's a infographic there's two infographic links in there, one that TWB worked on last year, but another one that Maeve and her team worked on with us just recently. We just published this last month, so a lot of people probably haven't seen it. And it's an infographic that shows a bunch of tips, over 20 different language tips for effective humanitarian data collection. And I think it touches on almost everything we just discussed in this workshop, the different stages of the response and data collection, how you can incorporate language lessons. And it's got a lot of good resources there too. So if there's any one resource that you look at after this, I think that'd be a great one to help synthesize some of what we discussed here.
Great, yeah, and building on that, we'll also be using some of the content of the presentations and also the answers from the poll questions to write up a quick blog as a blog post on TWB's blog, so that we can have some trace of the discussion today, besides, of course, the recorded presentation that will be shared by the organization team.
Well, thanks to you all then. I'll close the session now, as it's needed for the next plenary in half an hour. So thanks to all our speakers, and hope you're all joining us for the FailFest, another honest way of showing issues that can occur in data-related projects. And else, have a very nice end of GeoNG. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.